Says starting. It says we are live. Do we believe it or not? Oh, it says have the yellow symbol saying live. We're live. Glenn, welcome to this extraordinary Monday edition of In the Mood for HTTP. How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing good. I'm happy that we're getting closer to on time. I think we're still off by a minute or two, but I think if we use margin of error, we can just
Yeah.
say we're on time this time.
And if you round, right? If you round to the
Well,
nearest 5 minutes.
margin of error. You always have like that plus or minus.
Okay.
And with all the different clocks of the world, that may not be in sync. I think we can let's just say today we are on time. We really need a jingle because this would be playing a trumpet right now.
Yes. We should get on that, Glenn, right? One of us should sort that out.
I'm doing really well.
Before we get into the wonderfully useful content that we're about to share with all of our listeners, let's hear a message from our sponsor, Auth0 Extend.
Yes. Extend is an embedded scripting environment for customization and integration of your SaaS. Your customers and internal teams can rapidly customize and extend your SaaS without having to modify the product and without incurring the development, hosting, and management overhead of handling webhooks. So you can find out more at auth0.com/extend.
Excellent. So I believe you have an article that you discovered that has some interesting insights into the web and the future of the web. Tell us about it.
I do. Can you share?
That one. Yeah, no, I can. I have to find it first.
So Anil Dash published a pretty interesting post. Well, most things that he publishes are interesting, called "The Missing Building Blocks of the Web." And if you don't know who Anil Dash is, I mean, one, he's like a Twitter superstar that has like over 500,000 followers on Twitter, and he's been a very active spokesperson. And he's also the CEO of a company, Fog Creek Software, which is building Glitch. And Glitch is a really cool tool that makes it really easy to just kind of build web. It's like allows you to build out like websites and simple servers, but it's got this really cool community aspect to it that allows people to like share content, help each other. You'll use it for like building out a node server, not necessarily for something that would go for production, but more just trying things out. And they've really got the social thing going on. And one of the things he talked about is the fact that, in this article, this missing building blocks of the web, he talks about view source. And he says that, view source today is like a really broken experience. A lot of mobile devices don't support it. It's often really hidden away. And, it's almost like the notepad of the web. I'm using that term, but it's like when you look at view source, it's a fairly sparse, limited kind of experience. And I think what he's talking about is, hey, we can make this a lot better. We can have a much richer experience for viewing the source. And this aligns with the kind of things that Glitch has been working on in their product. And then he just goes into a lot of historical information about Tim Berners-Lee and what were the principles of, the creation of the web and what were the goals about sharing information, making it really easy for people to build things together. Some of that, I think you can easily argue, has happened. And, when we look at just looking at all the websites that are out there, but then he starts to go into, and actually around the view source thing, one of the interesting things they recently rolled out was like a GitHub style kind of diff tool for viewing the different versions of your code as you're authoring and changing, and just providing a really nice inline experience, which he's done another post on. So that kind of fits in, I guess, into that improving the view source experience.
It's fascinating the impact that view source has had. I mean, for folks who are as old as me and maybe you, Glenn,
remember that hurts.
We remember the days when when the source was the crown jewels, right? We used to, encrypt like it was compiled and obfuscated so nobody could decompile it, and like everything was.
Well, in the early days, it wasn't. Oh, you're talking about source in general for applications or
well,
web
that's right.
source?
Yeah, well, no, just source in general. It was like we everybody want. I mean, back in the the late '80s, early '90s, you protected that source code,
Yes.
and you didn't want anybody to see it because it was your
Yes.
secret source, right?
Yes.
And it's interesting that the fact that the web forced that source code to be visible and shareable and reusable has driven complete change to the industry. And it's interesting now that we're getting back to this point that, as Anil points out, that it's now because of other tech that's come in, it's starting to lose that advantage of being able to share and propagate the education and the reuse.
The really interesting thing is how like minification, for example, came along and gave people the ability to then kind of obfuscate that code similarly for the web, which then made view source, like you said, almost obsolete, because you go and view it and you just get this cryptic thing. And then it's an interesting kind of quagmire, because companies view the code that they're writing as like IP, but it's not just the viewing of the code as being IP. It's also not wanting people to have the ability to modify that client code, because in some cases people are transpiling code to say that, oh, based on your security level, there are certain things you shouldn't be able to do at the client side. And you can lock things down at the server, but there's only there's still going to be things that possibly somebody could hack the JavaScript to do, and they're trying to prevent that. So it's like it's an interesting tension that goes on between people that want to have access to that source and companies that want to secure that source as if it was more a binary kind of thing. And then of course you have like WebAssembly, which takes kind of
well, that's going to change the landscape again, right?
And we should talk about that, by the way. Do you want to? I know this wasn't on the plans, but related.
Well, I'm going to show my ignorance if we talk about that. Well, how about we talk about transclusion, because that's an interesting concept.
Yep. So that was the thing that really caught me on the article, was the concept of transclusion. So transclusion is this idea that a web page could or a site could include content embedded from another site. Actually, the first time I saw this word is, I believe that with either Collection JSON or Uber, one of the formats that Mike worked on, when he talked about links, he would also talk about transclusion.
Right, and I think Mike got that phrase from a lot of the work done by Ted Nelson many years ago. And if anybody's interested in some really interesting ways that maybe the web could have happened differently, Ted Nelson's got some great work out there. He did a project called Project Xanadu, which was an alternative to the way Tim Berners-Lee designed the web. And actually, Ted did the work way before Tim did his work on the web. And one of the major differences was Ted had this idea that links should be two-way. That you could not only link to some other content, but you could see what linked to you, and there should never be broken links. The idea of 404 was right. Just something that should never really happen. And Ted had all kinds of interesting ideas about the idea of distributed publication and micropayments. And this is where this idea of transclusion, where you could create an article where you embed content from other people, and this micropayment system would contribute to all the different authors who were included in the compiled document. He's a fascinating person to listen to and read some of the work that he's done.
Yeah, he was also very active in kind of the early ideas, even around hypermedia as well.
I believe he actually coined the phrase.
He did, because I remember when I gave my CodeMania talk years ago on hypermedia, and where its origins and such, that I included some works by Ted Nelson. But so where he was going though with this transclusion idea, or what Anil was talking about, it reminded me of the old mashups. So what he was saying was that, the web, the vision of the web and this idea of transclusion was that you could be building sites that are pulling and embedding other sites, not just embedding the data, but actually embedding whole portions of those sites. And he talks about how, about 10 years ago, there was some energy around this. And if you remember, for a while, it was all mashups. You don't hear anything about mashups anymore, but mashups were like a big deal, which was all about bringing together, building a site that you could bring together like different kinds of widgets. But a lot of those widgets had to be like pre-constructed. You had some work that was done. And of course, HTML has the concept of iframe, which iframes were often used as the way to do those older mashups. And iframes gave you that security or some levels of security isolation from domain perspective for doing that kind of embedding, but they had other costs associated with them. But a lot of that energy seems to have gone away. Like, you don't hear a lot of people really talking about mashups. And I don't know exactly what he's getting at, other than it sounds like with Glitch or with the work they're doing, they're trying to bring that back, that idea of me being able to build a site that was, embedding content from lots of other sites together. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. The other interesting aspect on the post, if you want to scroll down, oh, you already done it, is this idea of like, today we're so bound to different services like Facebook, Instagram, etc., for getting things out there. And you can build your own site, but, most people don't do it anymore. And I think what he's getting at here is like, hey, we could make that easier. We could make it easier. What if you could just have your own site and your site became the central place to learn everything about you, rather than you having to plug into all these other services? Now, that could also be very disruptive, of course, to all those other services that are out there. But it's an interesting idea. So it'll be great to see where this is, where they're going to take this.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. I mean, because you take, a site like Medium, where Anil's actually written this, like people kind of go there because they know that that's where people go to discover content. But there's no reason why that content needs to be hosted by that particular site. It could be hosted elsewhere on your own servers and then just incorporated into some kind of frame and aggregated into the Medium thing. There's always been sort of this, I want to own my own content, and I don't like putting my content on somebody else's site. And I think with some of the recent revelations with regards to the challenges of advertiser-driven content or advertiser-paid-for content, we may be getting back into a place where content is paid for. I mean, so many people use services like Netflix to watch video. Why can't, and Pluralsight for training, or Lynda for training, LinkedIn Learning as it's now called, why not for written content too? Where I can host my own content and then through some kind of subscription type payment be able to access quality content without all of the horrendous advertisements and sponsored links and so on and so forth. I think there's definitely a need to bring some of the balance back to distributed content as opposed to centralized content.
I mean, this is something like WordPress was trying to go for, although you hosted your WordPress site and then you had all the widgets and things to configure it together. Wix is a pretty interesting site that I think has hit closer to this. I don't know if you're familiar with Wix.
I've heard of them. I've never tried.
My daughter runs her blog there. Wix.com, and it just makes it really simple to kind of build up your own content site with, and you can host it on Wix.com. They might have a way where you can I think they have a way where you can download it and run it yourself. But it's this idea, if you want to bring it up, just Wix.com. It makes it really easy and fun. And what I found interesting about it was, I don't hear a lot of kids get excited about WordPress, but a lot of kids get excited about Wix.
Interesting.
And so anyway, it'll be interesting to see where Anil and where Glitch goes with this. And good to see them looking back at some of the, because we're always focused on the new and latest and greatest things.
Yeah, instead of learning from the
go
history,
back to the foundational pieces. Right, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Well,
so
there's our little glancing into the crystal ball, and
which wasn't so little.
When is it ever when you and I start chatting, eh, Glenn? So we had a conversation earlier this week talking a little bit about redirect headers, and we have a bit of a gluttony of choices when it comes to redirect headers. We've got 300s and 301s and 302s and 303s and 307s and 308s. How do you know when to use one versus the other is definitely one question. And then the conversation you brought up to me was, well, what gets transferred over? What continues with the redirect? Which headers get propagated on automatically and which ones don't? Which
well, my other concern was what you said too, which is I just don't think this is well understood. Like most people have 1 or 2, 3 status codes, that 30X status codes that they know, like they've seen like 303 or they've seen like 301. I don't think a lot of developers, like the average developer who's building a site or an API really knows about things. And that's another thing is like, this is part of HTTP. It's not part of, like, you may be used to seeing redirects when you hit a web page, but your APIs and many of them do redirects. And I think it's just not well understood. Like, what are the different semantics? Because there are different semantics because code. Otherwise, useless.
At many points in my history, I've known and understood all of them, but I just forget them because information leaks through my head like a sieve. So I always come back to this one particular spec, which is actually the most recent spec with regards to redirects, and it's for the status code 308. So usually I just pull up this spec and then I scroll down a little bit, and in the introduction is this little table here, which I always find is fabulously useful, and it basically categorizes
if you find it.
Well, it's really easy. So you go to your favorite search engine and you type IETF 308.
Oh yeah.
And there you go. There's this
and I'm sure that's what the average person is going to
absolutely do. And then you look at this little colored bar at the top here. This colored bar. Did you realize that those colored bars actually mean different things? They have significance. Click for color legend. See? Right, click here.
Draft or
this one is obsolete. Informational, experimental, best common practice, right? So this one is obsolete, and it has been obsoleted by 7538. So we click over here.
The problem with this stuff is that it needs to be reinterpreted and communicated from mere mortals, because the average developer, is not going to go through this, nor should they necessarily be expected to.
Well, that's an excellent point, and maybe we can bring a whole other conversation around that. But for those of you who actually want to know what the different status codes are, what they mean, and what the subtle difference is, this table has the answer. Go on, Glenn.
Oh no, I also don't want to imply that by saying that I mean that there are people that don't want to know what it is. Like, I think they do want to know what it is, but don't want to navigate this. I talked about the notepad of the web when I talked about view source.
Yeah,
this is also still very much in that in that notepad of the web style.
Yeah, yes.
Which I guess one plus is I can copy paste it to Notepad.
So that brings up another, because we like going on tangents today. Do you see how all of that table is done with ASCII art?
Yes.
We now have an official standard of how to include SVG content in IETF specs, and wow. I believe also Unicode is going to be supported in IETF. So expect to start seeing emojis in your RFCs anytime soon.
Well, this is one of the foundations of the web, so I imagine maybe Anil will be giving a post about how he's bringing back ASCII art. You forgot.
Okay, let's focus for a moment. Okay,
it's difficult for us.
So we have basically all those status codes are divided into either permanent or temporary redirects. And the benefit of the permanent redirect is if a client gets a permanent redirect, what it's supposed to do is if it has stored any bookmarks to resources, it's supposed to go and update those bookmarks so that it never has to follow that redirect again whilst using those bookmarks. Temporary redirects say, look, yeah, sorry, I made you do the 2 round trips, but you're pretty much always going to have to do it because I might change where I'm going to redirect you to in the future. So those are the 2 main classes. And then the 2 main differences in behavior are shown by these 2 rows in the table, with the first row being it allows to change the request method from a post to a get, and the second one is doesn't allow changing the post to a get. Now,
Interesting.
the important thing
you're live, remember
I
that.
lost my train of thought for a moment there. So you'll see that there is a missing, there's the dash there, and that's where the 308 lives. So the 308 doesn't allow you to change the HTTP, the response, the HTTP method. So if you do a post and you get a 308, then you're expected to do a post.
Can you talk about? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, no, finish, because I literally just cut you off.
The 308 says this is a permanent change of location for this resource, and if you do a post, you're expected to do a post to the new location also.
Got it. So I think this whole idea of permanent versus temporary for myself is not even really clear, because I find like people will use temporary redirects for a long time. So can you talk about what permanence, and maybe I'm just using a different definition of what permanent means, but what is the difference between permanent and temporary? And forgive me if this is a dumb question, and yes, this is from somebody who wrote a book on web APIs and HTTP.
Okay, so let's consider some examples, right? Let's say you are moving your blog to a new location and you bought yourself a custom domain, because previously you used to be hosted on Blogspot or some other AzureWebsites.net, and you realized, look, I'm really good at this, so you bought yourself a new domain. And if anybody out there has some RSS reader, or they've got some favorites in their browser, or they've written some client that comes and scrapes your website for all your amazing content, and you're moving it to a new host, then you want to use a permanent redirect because you don't want people to ever call that old URL again. Okay? Now, whereas for a temporary redirect, if you remember all the way back to, I think, our first episode of the new season, we talked about a pattern called the alias pattern. And the alias pattern was all about using a pretty name to download large content from some storage location. So you would go to my domain / download giant blob of binary, and instead of downloading it from my host where they're going to charge me per very expensive bytes, I'm going to redirect to some cheaper storage mechanism where I can allow the end user to download that content a lot cheaper. But I don't want to be tied to what backend storage provider I may use in the future, because today I may be using some AWS storage, tomorrow some Google, the day after some Azure cloud storage. So I want to use a temporary redirect so that everybody continues to go to the canonical pretty URL, but I can then redirect them to the place where they can download the bytes for cheap.
I see. So if I do a 301, I'm really saying lose this URL.
Yes.
And start using this other new one going forward.
Because we moved, right? That's the status, moved permanently.
Right. So what does that mean? Like in an API context, I think in most cases, this just gets ignored. Because, like, not ignored, because a lot of HTTP clients, like Request for Node, for example, can follow redirects. you know, or using like .NET client, any HTTP client. Most of them have like middleware or some way of being able to follow redirects. But for their perspective, whether it's a 301 or a 302 doesn't really matter, right? Like it doesn't go back and update in any way to tell the user that, by the way, the code that you're calling, you shouldn't call this URL anymore.
Well, I mean, you could use it. You can use it for a particular endpoint that is obsoleted because,
Yeah.
well, you were having performance issues with the way, the type of data that it was returning back. So you're saying, look, don't call this resource anymore. Call this other resource because
Right.
this is much more efficient way of getting it. Or maybe you moved from your V1 of your API to your V2 of your API, but only some of the resources actually changed in behavior. Many of them, when you moved over, have identical behavior. So on all the V1s, you could just put a permanent redirect on there and tell a client, hey, start looking at the V2 API because we've got this new one that will do the same thing for you, but maybe better. Right? So there are, as long as clients are built to understand what the intent is of those status codes, then you can start advertising, look, don't call this thing anymore, call this other thing because it's better for some reason.
Yeah, I think most clients just do the, okay, I got the 300 code. That means I'm going to call to another URL.
Yeah, and that's because we have a very bad habit of building really dumb HTTP clients, and we need to get better with that.
So on that
So,
note, can we drill in more to some of the semantics of the different codes? Like right now, we've got this table. So
right.
there's more than just the three that are listed there, or are there only four? No,
No,
because there's
there's
303,
more.
but yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so let's go back to the first one, right, which is the 300 status code. The 300 status code. Let me try and remember exactly what multiple choices. There you go. That's what it's called. So the idea of the 300 status code is it returns back a representation to the client saying, well, you asked for that resource, but I got a bunch of different representations of that resource. You can take this one over here that's in JPEG. You can take this one over here that's a PDF version. You can have this one over here that's HTML, or this one over here that's plain ASCII, right? And then the client has to somehow make a decision as to which one it wants, right? One of the challenges, and we run into this challenge a lot with the HTTP spec, is the HTTP spec didn't tell you exactly what that multiple choices payload looks like. And nobody has, I don't think anybody has really formally said this is an ideal shape of the response body for a multiple choices. So because that hasn't been standardized, there hasn't been a lot of tooling built around that. And what people have tended to do is use server-driven negotiation for this same purpose. What they'll do is people will send an accept header that says, well, if you've got a JPEG, I'd like that. If you don't, then I'll take a PDF. And if you don't, then I'll take an HTML, right? And then they send up a request with the accept header saying, these are all the different variants that I support. And the server decides which representation that it's going to return back, as opposed to returning back a list of these are the representations that you can choose from. So it's one of those status codes that's good to have in your back pocket because it can be handy if you're building a particular type of client, but it isn't one that you really see used very much in the wild. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So moving on with 301, which is moved permanently. So this is the one we've talked about. You're moving to a whole new domain. Ideally you don't want anybody to ever call that old one ever again, because ideally you'd like to turn that site off at some point in the future and give clients an opportunity.
That's what a 301. So this one is interesting, right? Because this means that if your client is not captured, like if you're using a client that is not somehow letting you know, and where this really becomes interesting too is with SDKs that often, I guess with an SDK, if it's something that is produced by the company that owns the server, then they might just update the SDK to now go to the new URL. So this is really a clue to somebody who's built their own client.
Yeah,
That often that information doesn't get detected.
But you know as well as I do, you release a new version of the SDK. That doesn't require everybody who's using your old SDK to immediately run off and
Right.
implement,
Of course.
deploy the new one,
As
right?
long as you have a client that walks those 300 codes.
Yeah.
Which I think what we're saying here is that, really, if you are building an HTTP client or, an SDK or something like that, you should, if you're being like a good citizen, you should actually make sure that that client is supporting redirects.
Yes. Yes. Well, and a lot of client libraries do support it under the covers, right?
Right. Well, but some of them you have to enable it. They won't do it.
Some you have to enable, some that do it under the covers. And as we were talking about last week, some of them have some very specialized behavior with regards to how they make that secondary request. And I was saying to you that in the .NET space, the built-in library there in the .NET framework will drop the authentication header when it redirects to the new location. So you make an authenticated request to one location, and you receive back a response that has a redirect. You make it to the new location, and all of a sudden you get a 401 back because it didn't actually send that auth header to the second location. And people go, but I sent an auth header. It doesn't make any sense. And they don't notice the fact that under the covers, there's a redirect that's being followed. So in those cases, you got to turn off the built-in redirect mechanism and either implement your own, or there's another way of using a built-in credential cache that also takes that into account.
Yep. Makes sense.
So yes, there's definitely in different platforms there's different levels of support for these headers. Okay, so that's 301 moved permanently.
Well, what do you think should happen with those security headers? Do you think those should drop, or do you think those should be included?
Okay, well, so I believe you should be able to maintain those headers as long as you're just talking to the same host.
So what happens with WebSockets and things like that in this world? Are they, I'm guessing,
they're not in this world, right?
Right.
I mean, they upgraded out of the HTTP world.
Right, but could the upgrade cause a redirect? Or... like if you were going to say that the WebSocket portion was going to be handled by another endpoint, would it be reasonable to do like a redirect on an upgrade? Or would you say the redirect would actually happen on the resource that you did the initial get against, and then you would do the upgrade from there?
Yeah, I think you do a request, you would redirect to a new location, and then an upgrade would occur. Is my guess, because the upgrade happens on the connection that you've established.
Yep.
And a redirect could point you to a completely different host. So I think the redirect would happen first. So you're still in HTTP world at that point.
Yep.
So the next one is 302 found, right? And if we go back to our table, it allows changing the post to a get, and it is a temporary. So this is what is it called? The PRG pattern, post redirect get pattern, that's very common on the whole web, where you post a form and to submit a form, you get some result, or you get a redirect back that then points you to the thing that you just created. So that's a very common pattern on the web for using the 302 found.
Okay.
Which brings us to the odd one out, and I'm going to bail on actually giving some clear answer here, because the 303 is not actually included in this list, and I believe there's basically some overlap of this request between 303 and 302, I believe. I don't have a clear answer to you as to why this is, because you see, I always go to this table and use this table to tell me which status code to use, and it's not included in that table, so I tend not to use it. But maybe I'll have an answer for you next week as to when you should use 303 instead of 302. Unless you can quickly read that and tell us exactly why on earth you should be using that.
Yeah, I have no idea.
It's not like it's been around for a while or anything, and we've both probably spent hundreds of hours reading this thing. But anyway, moving on. Notice there's a missing one here.
304.
Yeah, 304. So what's 304, Glenn?
I don't remember.
Not modified.
Oh, of course. Right.
Yeah, see, you missed last week's episode. We talked about not modified.
Right.
For conditional requests, we
Right.
do a get.
For ETA, conditional gets. I actually do know this. It's just too early in the morning. Or I wasn't thinking about it in the context of a redirect.
I know. And
so why does it fit? Why is it actually in the 300 range?
I don't really know.
Which is why it didn't pop to me.
Yeah, and it's not listed here in but for some reason it lives in the 300 range, and it returns back in basically an empty body saying you've already got that thing. I don't need to give it you. Maybe it means redirect and get the content from your local cache instead of getting it from me.
Sounds like a bit of an abuse.
Yes, there's probably some interesting historical thing there. So 305, look this, it is now deprecated. So we don't use 305, so that's good. Moving on.
I love it. There's a 306 unused.
Yes, it's saved for some future use. And 307 is our temporary redirect. And moving back to our delightful table, this is the one that says don't change. And then the important thing there is it's really the one you want to use where you post to one location and then you redirect somebody and you want them to post to a second location. And of course, that's always a little nerve-wracking when you have automatic redirects, because if somebody's able to intercept that in some way and you're posting some sensitive information, you
mean
can
like a man in the middle kind of attack?
Yes. If somebody can somehow change that location header, then they can then have you posting to that information to a completely different location. So obviously you have to be a little...
So we're getting some posts from the channel that I just want to share.
Cool.
So Seb has said that you could have a 300 with link headers with a rel of alternate if you don't care about the representation.
Yep. But really that's just, taking a non-standardized payload and moving it up into standardized headers.
Yes.
So, yeah. Yep.
Yes. And then the other thing that Seb said for historical reasons is that 306 was used by micropayments, but it never went anywhere.
Yeah, interesting. And that rel equals payment is back in force now too. I haven't heard much in the last couple of months, but I know there was a lot of work going back on that. So we'll have to see whether that comes back or not. I wonder what it meant. 306, you have paid? I don't know.
Also a weird one with redirects, right? Like I'd be curious on that one of how that fits in with payments. Like, is it redirecting you to go make a payment?
I don't know. Go pay that guy over there.
Yep.
Okay. So have we beaten the subject to death?
I think we have.
Okay.
I think we've beaten it to death. And
okay, so remember,
we've at least given people the place where they can go if our descriptions are not adequate,
right?
To understand the.
Look, and I'll even prove it works with not just Google as a search engine. Oh, don't mistype stuff like that. There we go. Whew. IETF 308. Look at that. Look at that. And there's the magical table. So if you ever need to know, that's how you find out which one is which.
And we will share this in our blog post if we ever get around to doing it.
And we'll at least tweet it on the Twitter account, right?
Yeah. Sounds
Okay.
good.
So in our schedule of things to talk about, this was supposed to take up like the first 5 minutes.
Yes.
And we're 45 minutes in, Glenn.
Yes.
Okay. Moving on.
This means we've got a lot for the next episode.
Yeah, there you go.
But it would be great if we can get to the pattern of the week.
Okay, yes, pattern of the week, the bucket pattern. I like to call this the bucket pattern. So this is a way of being able to change the status of the resource. Now, there are a whole variety of ways of changing the status. If you look, there's the mini put, there's the just using the patch method. There's a whole bunch of different ways.
What is a mini put? You just used a term that you dropped out there. What is a mini put?
Well, I didn't, because it's a pattern. You click on the link. Mini put is a way you create a little mini resource for just the status attribute, and then you put on that attribute to change the status of a resource. Okay. So that's why it's called a mini put. But bucket is a little bit different, but it achieves the same objective of being able to change the status of a resource. And it also then gives you the ability to go and see all of the resources that are of that particular status. So when you do, going back to our classic issue tracking application, and you want to see issues that are open, of the status open, you go to /issues/open, which is the resource of all issues that are open. If you want to change the status of a resource, then you post that resource into a bucket that is named by that status. So it's a fairly easy pattern. It has some advantages in that,
this is so pending review. That's the oh, I see.
Yeah. Okay. So and you would generally take when you take a resource and you put it into one bucket, it will magically disappear from the other bucket generally, because they are status buckets. A resource can't live in two buckets.
So this second example here with pending review, this is where I want to actually change the status of a thing that I'm posting to be put into the pending review status.
Yes.
Which is actually not what we did with the issue tracker. So with the issue tracker, we used we used like query string parameters or something to change to specify the status, rather than the URL itself to specify the status bucket. But what you're saying is we could have used this status bucket approach.
And there's no value judgment here. It's just a different way. So here
mapping it against something.
Yeah. So we take this, we've previously retrieved this issue that is open. We post it into pending review.
Yeah.
And then when it comes back, it says, now my status is pending review.
Gotcha.
It's fairly straightforward and simple, and it is a nice pattern to use if you want to ensure that something can only have one status. You don't want to use a patch or put for some reason, and you want it to be very clear, and there's valid use cases for being able to get at a set of objects that have a very particular specific status.
Right. And so one of the places this is interesting is the browser. Like if you were like doing a form post, for example, you only have really post as available.
Yeah.
So this would be a way to still enable. And yeah, I mean, it sounds almost close to the idea of using child resources for enabling updates as well through post. Like you could have a resource and then you could actually utilize the URI, utilize sub resources.
Yeah.
For handling updates to specific parts of that resource.
Yeah. The other interesting part of it is generally when you're modeling payloads and you have a status, you tend to define them as a kind of an enum.
Yeah.
And then you can end up with coupling issues between the client and the server where you end up, I want to add a new enum. Sure. And all of a sudden it breaks the strongly typed client, and then all is a mess. Whereas this, you could just add a new bucket for a new status. And it's just a resource. It's not part of your data model at all.
So this caters to kind of the evolvability of the web.
It can help in some scenarios. Yes.
Yeah, great. This is
Okay.
awesome.
Cool. So shall we call that a day and save our later topics for another day?
I think we both learned that we're pretty weak on time management, but the good thing here is that we're not bound, right? As long as we're covering interesting topics and we just queue them up for the next.
Actually, you know what? I've got one more that we're going to talk about. Okay, because
Right,
this one's a short one. This I discovered. Actually, a few people have kind of pointed to this. It's in the GitHub HTTP working group, HTTP extensions. And it's a document that's called Using HTTP as a Substrate, which is a terribly unfriendly way of saying things. But this
very fitting for the HTTP spec world.
Yes. You can think of this as the ultimate in API guidelines. This basically, you know how we read all those API guidelines, all those different people write, and we go, "That's not RESTful, and that doesn't do things properly. That isn't self-descriptive," and we complain. Well, this is one that actually fits really nicely into the REST world without ever mentioning the word REST.
Okay.
So, if you want some interesting reading, this is a very handy or an eye-opening look at how
so it is a best practices document. It's not tied to any specific vendor. It's actually around HTTP itself.
It is
and it's
purely
not tied to any specific set of APIs. It's really taking a lot of the idea. I mean, even when Roy, I saw actually one thing I'll share a link to it later. I saw a really interesting 10-minute interview with Roy Fielding about why he created HTTP and REST and all of that. And it was really fascinating. But he talked about this idea of like wanting to encapsulate the practices and things that were being used for utilizing the web, the infrastructure of the web.
Yep. Well, this has got some really interesting perspectives in here that some people may find are a little hard to swallow, but it is definitely good advice.
Have you read through the whole thing?
No, I've skimmed it to get a feel for its content. It's one of those things that I'll save for a plane trip at one point to really go through it in detail.
Nice.
So with that, we'll leave our delightful viewers with some future reading. And awesome. We will talk again in a couple of weeks, Glenn.
Looking forward to it, Daryl.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.